And welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, March 29, 2022. Peace talks in Turkey between Russia and Ukraine yielding what some news reports are calling a potential breakthrough towards peace. Russia saying it is scaling back its military assault on the Ukrainian capital city of Kyiv and a second city in the north, Chernihiv, while Ukraine says it may be ready to give up control of territory that Russia wants in Crimea and the Donbass in the eastern part of the country. But U.S. President Joe Biden and Secretary of State Antony Blinken both skeptical that Russia is pulling back in a meaningful way. And Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby calling it a repositioning, not a withdrawal of forces. The director of the White House Office of Management and Budget, Shalanda Young, testifying before the House Budget Committee in Washington about the president's $5.8 trillion fiscal year 2023 budget proposal. We'll hear from her and talk with Military Times Deputy Editor Leo Shane about the president's plans for defense spending. FDA authorizing a second coronavirus vaccine booster shot for people ages 50 and older. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention still needs to give the okay before the shots can be handed out. And honoring the late Congressman Don Young, Republican from Alaska, lying in state today in the U.S. Capitol. He died a week ago after serving more than 49 years in Congress. This from Associated Press. Russia's military announced Tuesday it will fundamentally scale back operations near Ukraine's capital and a northern city as talks brought the outlines of a possible deal to end the grinding war into view. Deputy Defense Minister Alexandra Fomin said that the move was meant to increase trust in the talks after several rounds of negotiations failed to halt what has devolved into a bloody campaign of attrition. That's how AP puts it. At the White House in Washington, President Joe Biden asked about this development in the war.
Darlene Superville, Associated Press.
Thank you, Mr. President. What is your view of Russia's announcement today that it will, quote, fundamentally scale back its military operations near Kyiv and another northern city in Ukraine? Do you see this as possibly the war beginning to come to an end, or do you see this as Russia trying to buy time and to recalibrate for a new military effort?
We'll see. I don't read anything into it until I see what their actions are. We'll see if they follow through on what they're suggesting. There are negotiations that have begun today, or not begun, continued today, one in Turkey and others. I had a meeting with the heads of state of our four allies in NATO, France, Germany, the United States, and Great Britain. And there seems to be a consensus that let's just see what they have to offer. We'll find out what they do. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to keep strong the sanctions. We're going to continue to provide the Ukrainian military with their capacity to defend themselves. And we're going to continue to keep a close eye on what's going on. Thank you.
President Joe Biden at the White House. It was during a joint news conference with the visiting Prime Minister of Singapore. Reuters' take on the peace talks in Turkey. They write that Russia promised on Tuesday to scale down military operations around Kyiv and northern Ukraine as a confidence-building step and the most tangible sign yet of progress towards negotiating an end to the war. During talks at a palace in Istanbul, Ukraine, for its part, proposed adopting neutral status and the most detailed formula yet for potential settlement to the 5-week conflict. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken traveling to Morocco, saying today that it is more important to watch what Russia does than to accept at face value what Russia says.
As a result of this aggression committed by Russia, as I mentioned the other day, fully half of the children in Ukraine have been displaced from their homes. Half of the children. And of course, we've seen what is going on in Mariupol, among other places. So we're focused on what Russia does. And what it should do is end the aggression now. Stop firing, pull its forces back, and of course engage in talks. The fact that the Ukrainians have the extraordinary courage and willingness and determination not only to stand up for their country and their futures, but to engage in these talks with a gun literally to their head, I think speaks volumes. But I would look to them to characterize whether there's anything meaningfully coming. If there is some kind of outcome. And if our support for Ukraine can be part of that outcome, including our support in the future for its defense and security, of course, that's something we'll want to pursue. But again, from what I have not seen anything that suggests that this is moving forward in an effective way, because Russia, at least we've not seen signs of real seriousness. But if Ukraine concludes that there is, that's good, and we support that.
The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken traveling to Morocco, answering a reporter's question at a joint news conference with the Moroccan foreign minister. New York Times writes that Russian military strikes and Ukrainian counteroffensives continued across the country on Tuesday, and it remained to be seen if the progress both sides reported in peace talks would shift the dynamic of the fighting. In the talks held in Istanbul, Russia promised to reduce military activity near the capital, where its forces have struggled. Ukraine outlined potential concessions of territory that Russia had long seized in Crimea and the east of the country. Some analysis of the situation now from the Pentagon. Press Secretary John Kirby opening his briefing with this.
I do want to take a couple of minutes right at the beginning of the briefing to talk about things in Ukraine. There's been a lot of reporting today on withdrawals and Russian decisions, and I think it's really important that we put a little bit of this into context. So first, again, we've seen that Russia has attempted now for going on a month to sell this war of theirs to its domestic audience as a, quote, liberation of the Donbass. However, the intensified rhetoric over the last year and in the lead-up to Russia's invasion demonstrated that the Kremlin's real intent was to overthrow the democratically elected government and to occupy or annex large portions of Ukraine. The posture of Russian forces around Kyiv, along much of the Black and the Azov Sea coasts, and in central and northeastern Ukraine indicates the geographic scale of this ambition. They've been attacking Ukraine, as we have been talking about now for several weeks, on multiple lines of axis. Russia's intent was to replace Ukrainian regional and national authorities and create so-called people's republics, as displayed recently in Kherson province. The rapid advance to Kyiv in the initial days of the war showed very clearly for all of us that Kyiv and the capital city was a key objective for the Russians. So we ought not be fooling, and nobody should be fooling ourselves, by the Kremlin's now recent claim that it will suddenly just reduce military attacks near Kyiv, or any reports that it's going to withdraw all its forces. Has there been some movement by some Russian units away from Kyiv in the last day or so? Yeah, we think so. Small numbers. But we believe that this is a repositioning, not a real withdrawal, and that we all should be prepared to watch for a major offensive against other areas of Ukraine. It does not mean that the threat to Kyiv is over. Russia has failed in its objective of capturing Kyiv. It's failed in its objective of subjugating Ukraine. But they can still inflict massive brutality on the country, including on Kyiv. We see that even today in continued airstrikes against the capital city. Mr. Putin's goals stretch far beyond the Donbass. The Russian Ministry of Defense's recent talking points may be an effort to move the goalposts, moderating Russia's immediate goals and spinning its current lack of progress as part of what would be next steps. But it's too early to judge what additional actions the Kremlin may take. No amount of spin can mask what the world has witnessed over the past month, and that's the courage and the military prowess of Ukraine's armed forces and its people, which are proving to be more than what Russia bargained for in its unprovoked and unjustified invasion. Now, that prowess is not accidental. We've talked about that a little bit. It's partly a result of the training and the support we and other allies over the last 8 years have been given to the Ukrainian armed forces. The United States, together with our allies and partners, we're going to continue to provide that support going forward to meet their security needs as they bravely stand up to this Russian aggression. I thought it was really important to kind of set the level straight there on that, because I've seen, again, lots of reporting here on these so-called withdrawals.
The Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby in the Pentagon briefing room. The United Nations Humanitarian Affairs Deputy Emergency Coordinator telling the UN Security Council today that more than 10 million Ukrainians, including more than half the population of children in Ukraine, have fled their homes since the onset of the war last month. Of those, 6.5 million are internally displaced, 3.9 million have crossed the borders to neighboring countries. Since the start of the war, the number of U.S. troops based in Europe has risen substantially. The Pentagon says the increase is temporary to counter Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the potential threat to NATO military alliance allies in Eastern Europe. But what is the prospect long-term that the U.S. troops will stay there? General Todd Walters is NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe, head of U.S. European Command, testifying in Washington before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Here's the question from Senator Roger Wicker, Republican from Mississippi.
In terms of permanently stationed forces in EUCOM, is our current posture enough? What are the numbers there, and should the United States have more permanent or rotational forces in EUCOM and specifically in the Baltics?
Senator, the numbers increase from a U.S. perspective as a result of the incursion into Ukraine by Russia have boosted our numbers from 60 to approximately 100,000. What I also examine in my other command hat is the increase of European involvement, and in specific targeting of what we're doing with respect to the population and the capability increase in the Baltics. We've seen a dramatic shift as a result of contributions from multiple nations. Several have been published in open press. Germany, the United Kingdom, Denmark have all been very, very generous with respect to their recent contributions to the EFP battle groups.
But, sir, what is your recommendation as to more permanent U.S. forces?
I think what we need to do from a U.S. force perspective is look at what takes place in Europe following the completion of the Ukraine-Russia scenario and examine the European contributions, and based off the breadth and depth of the European contributions, be prepared to adjust the U.S. contributions. And my suspicion is we're going to still need more. And obviously there's always a mix between the requirement of permanent versus rotational, and there are pluses and minuses of each one. We'll have to continue to examine the European contributions to make a smart decision about where to go in the future.
General Todd Walters, NATO Supreme Allied Commander and Commander of U.S. European Command, at the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, questioned by Senator Roger Wicker, Republican from Mississippi. Military Times Deputy Editor Leo Shane writes the Defense Department spending would see a 4% increase in fiscal 2023 under a plan released by the White House on Monday, significantly above what administration officials wanted last year, but likely not enough to satisfy congressional Republicans. And he joins us now by phone. Thank you for being here. How has Russia's war in Ukraine changed this annual debate over how much to spend on defense and what to spend it on?
Yeah, it hasn't directly affected it in the sense that the money that we're talking about here won't be available to the U.S. military until the end of the year. So we're not talking about giving specific equipment or specific funding to Ukraine or to other European forces, but there is a philosophy here about what is needed. There's more money for training foreign militaries, both in Europe and the Indo-Pacific region. There's more money for investment in hypersonic weapons, microelectronics, cutting-edge weapons, and plans to divest from legacy platforms, some older aircraft and some older ships. So the idea is to modernize the military, to invest a lot of money in it, but invest in a way that's different than the traditional paradigm we've seen in the past, where it's just lots of troops and lots of big equipment to directly fight against a foe like Russia.
You say that the Republicans likely won't accept 4%. How much do they want?
Yeah, that's going to be one of the rubs for this. I mean, the 4% boost brings this to $773 billion. This is double any other agency, but Republican lawmakers have already come out and said, look, with the rate of inflation and with just the threats around the world, not only should we be talking about at least keeping pace with inflation, which may be 6, 7, 8%, but really we need 5% above that. So they're looking at an increase somewhere in the range of 11 to 13%, what would be a massive boost, and frankly something that the Biden administration wouldn't really swallow here. Last year they suggested, just an increase that would keep pace with what they projected inflation to be. This year they're projecting, somewhere around 4%. So this, again, just a little bit more. But Republicans last year were successful in arguing with moderate Democrats that number needed to be plussed up. So it wouldn't be surprising if we saw this rise even higher over the course of debate over the next few months.
Returning to Ukraine for a moment, in the past number of years, we've been hearing about this pivot to Asia, where our focus, military and otherwise, would be to Asia. And now we're sort of being pulled back to Europe. Is the defense budget changing to reflect any of this?
Yes and no. I mean, they are still focused on China as the number one threat. We saw a partial release of the National Defense Strategy, which said China is the number one threat, not just on par with Russia, but actually above Russia. So the military is still focused there. But we are seeing, more of this idea of the need to have strong allies and strong relationships. So there's about $6 billion in here for the European Deterrence Initiative. That's training and assistance for militaries there. About $300 million of that would be marked specifically for Ukraine, for the kind of training that was being done before the war started there. But there's also $6 billion for the Indo-Pacific Defense Initiative. Same idea, other side of the world. So what we're seeing is a recognition of the need to not just plus up the U.S. military, but also to spend money on making sure other militaries are ready to present a defense, as we're seeing in Ukraine right now with the Russia aggression there.
We're talking with Leo Shane from Military Times. The budget proposal from the White House released yesterday. You had an opportunity to dig through what is probably a couple of volumes worth of information. Did anything surprise you in the proposal?
No, I haven't gone through the whole thing yet. It is a pretty massive document, but one of the things that jumped out for me is the 4.6% pay raise. That's the largest pay raise for troops in 20 years. It would go into effect next January. But that's a reflection of just the inflation and the higher cost of living that we've seen over the last year. So that's another issue where, that's likely the floor of the conversation at this point. It wouldn't be surprising if Republicans and some moderate Democrats push to go even higher with that to make sure that military families have the money that they need to, just to survive, just to make sure that they're making ends meet, considering that groceries are higher, gas is higher, things of that sort. And then the other thing that jumped out to me was that the Space Force is going to see a 35% increase. There was some conversation when Biden came into office whether or not Space Force would even last. This was a Trump idea and a Trump initiative. Some people had sort of laughed it off, but we're seeing some pretty significant investment in it by the Biden administration, adding 200 more Guardians to the force, and adding 35% more. It's about half of the total cost of the Marine Corps here. So it seems that service is here to stay now and is really a key part of the military strategy moving forward.
Leo Shane is deputy editor at the Military Times. Find his stories at militarytimes.com. Thank you very much.
No, thanks for the invite.
And the director of the White House Office of Management and Budget, Shalanda Young, starting 2 days of testimony today before Congress about President Biden's fiscal year 2023 federal budget proposal, both defense and non-defense spending, a total of $5.8 trillion. Today she was before the House Budget Committee. The ranking Republican on the committee is Jason Smith of Missouri, asking her about spending, deficits, and inflation.
What's concerning is this budget proposal projects starting today that inflation will be at 2% for the next 10 years, because the first year you say 4.7%, but already for the year it's over 8%. So it would have to be 2% every month for the rest of the year to meet those averages, plus 2% for the next 9 years. Completely unrealistic when we're probably going to hit double digits inflation. So to hit the inflation projections in this budget, it's madness. What policies in this budget brings it down where inflation will be at 2%?
Mr. Smith, I'm happy to walk you through how we do calculations for the budget. These numbers were locked in early November At the time, we were in line with blue chip private forecasters, but inflation is clearly at
So
a
5 months,
level.
Director, 5 months ago, you locked in these inflation numbers. So you did 4.7% 5 months ago, and 2 weeks ago it came out at 7.9%. You guys were off by almost double in that 5 month span. I just want to know, what policies do you all have in this proposal? Because spending $73 trillion just seems like it's only going to fuel the inflation fire. So I'd like to know how you're going to help the people of southern Missouri to be able to afford food on their table, clothes on their backs, and gasoline in their cars.
Yeah, I'm sure you have paid close attention to the president's plan on dealing with competition in the private sector and also improving supply chain challenges, which are global in nature. I'd also point out that inflation is a global trend. Almost every developed country is seeing inflationary growth. What that tells us is that we have a global issue. It's not one bill, one country, specific policies. This is something all major countries are facing coming out of the pandemic.
So I would be curious, does the president believe spending $73 trillion over the next 10 years will reduce inflation or increase inflation?
The president believes the fiscally responsible thing to do is to pay for our proposals. That is why you see this budget bring down deficits over the 10-year period by over $1 trillion.
Wow, Director. This proposal over the next 10 years actually increases the national debt by $16 trillion, which is going to have more than $1 trillion deficit every year for the next 10 years, which is the highest sustained amount of deficits in the history of our nation. And you're saying that this proposal is bringing down the deficits?
Ranking member, we all know that deficits and debt are two different things. We bring down the deficit by $1 trillion. The debt rises, as many of you know, because of entitlements. What this president is now going to do is put forth proposals to cut benefits for our seniors in this country.
The OMB Director, Shalanda Young, on Capitol Hill before the House Budget Committee. Questions from the ranking Republican on the committee, Jason Smith of Missouri. Well, part of President Biden's budget proposal for the next fiscal year is a 20% minimum tax on the very rich. White House says that tax would apply only to the wealthiest 0.1% of households, those with more than $100 million in assets, and that more than half the revenue raised would come from billionaires, estimated to raise $360 billion over 10 years. More from the House Budget Committee hearing. Congressman Brian Higgins, Democrat from New York, asking Director Young about this.
The American economy today is about $25 trillion. The billionaire's minimum tax, I presume, is a response to this whole concept of buy, borrow, and die. In other words, very wealthy people buy an asset, they build an asset, they borrow against the asset, and they never sell the asset, and therefore they don't pay taxes on it. Jeff Bezos from Amazon, for example, is worth $200 billion. He pays himself a salary of about $81,000 a year and pays very little taxes. So I presume that the billionaire's minimum tax is intended to address that, recognizing the fact that it's perfectly legal, but I presume that that's the purpose?
Yeah, I remind people, when regular people need a loan, you use your income to show the bank what you can borrow and pay back. The investment income that we're taxing here, often, as you pointed out, is never paid. Taxes are never paid on it. They're deferred. But they also get a lot of benefits from carrying that investment income, including getting to use that as leverage for loans. It is treated like income for many actions that regular people only have work income to do with, including making extraordinary loans against their investment income. So we believe we have to find a way to deal with this disparity of people who go to work every day. They're paying a higher tax rate on their work income. we have to find an equivalent way to deal with those who pay no income on taxes. They are supposed to at some point, but often defer.
Well, interestingly enough, Jeff Bezos in 2011 was only worth $18 billion, and he qualified for the child tax credit.
Congressman Brian Higgins, Democrat from New York, and OMB Director Shalenda Young. Today's House Budget Committee hearing ran about 3 hours. We covered it live on the C-SPAN networks. The video is available at cspan.org. On Wednesday, Director Young back before the Senate Budget Committee about the president's budget proposal for the next fiscal year. We'll have live coverage of that as well, 11 a.m. Eastern on Wednesday. Wall Street today, the Dow up 338, Nasdaq up 264, S&P at 56. From thehill.com, the Senate voted along party lines Tuesday to advance Michigan State University professor Lisa Cook's nomination to the Federal Reserve Board after a committee deadlocked on her nomination earlier this month. Senators voted 50 to 49 to move Cook along to full consideration to be confirmed for a seat on the Federal Board of Governors. All 50 Democratic senators voted to advance Cook, a former member of the White House Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, while 49 Republican senators voted against her. Senator John Kennedy, Republican of Louisiana, did not vote. Ahead of the vote, some remarks on the Senate floor, starting with Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat from Ohio. He chairs the Banking Committee.
She's unquestionably qualified, an economist with many years of experience. Went to graduate of Spelman, graduate of, was a Truman Scholar in England, something that very few Americans qualify for. It's a very small, elite, important program. She then, she got her PhD at Berkeley. She brings a breadth of research and international experience on monetary policy, on banking, on financial crises. In fact, she's one of the country's leading researchers on international economic growth and innovation economics. Dr. Cook currently serves as a dual tenured professor of economics and international relations at Michigan State. She previously taught at the Kennedy School of Government. She served on the Council of Economic Advisors during the Eurozone crisis and at the Department of Treasury. She's also an historic nominee. If confirmed, she'd be the first black woman ever in the more than 100-year history of the Fed. Think about that. 1913, the Federal Reserve began, created by this body in the House of Representatives, signed by President Wilson. 109 years, 7 governors on the Fed, most stay no more than 5 or 6 or 7 years. She will be the first black woman to serve on the Federal Reserve.
Senator Sherrod Brown is the chair of the Banking Committee, debating on the Senate floor. The committee ranking Republican is Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. He also spoke ahead of the vote to advance this nomination. He spoke against the nomination of Lisa Cook, saying she was not qualified, having little experience in monetary policy. And besides that, he says she has a political agenda.
It's extremely important that we keep politics out of the money supply. The Fed is supposed to be independent. The Fed is supposed to be apolitical so that it can focus on its job. But unfortunately, we've seen the encroachment of politics at the historically independent Federal Reserve, and we've seen that the Fed's not doing such a great job. There are people on the left, including in the Biden administration, who openly advocate that the Fed use its regulatory powers to address complex political issues, including things like what to do about global warming, social justice, even education policy. Look, these are all very, very important issues. Very important issues. But they're completely unrelated to the Fed's limited statutory mandate and expertise. Professor Cook's record indicates that these are the topics that interest her the most, and she's likely to inject further political bias into the Fed's work at a time, exactly the time when we need the Fed to be hyper-focused on getting inflation back under control.
Senator Pat Toomey on the Senate floor. Today's vote to bring Lisa Cook, the nomination, to the Senate floor, again, it passed on a party line vote, comes after the Banking Committee voted 12 to 12, again along party lines, on advancing the nomination, and tie votes fail. Washington Today continues in a minute.
Book TV, every Sunday on C-SPAN 2, features leading authors discussing their latest nonfiction books. In 2003, Professor Noam Chomsky was the first author on Book TV's In Depth, and since then he's written dozens of books. Live at noon Eastern on In Depth, join our 2-hour conversation with Mr. Chomsky as he rejoins us to talk about capitalism, U.S. foreign policy, and social exchange. Some of his most recent books include Hopes and Prospects, Consequences of Capitalism, and his forthcoming Notes on Resistance. And at 10 p.m. Eastern on Afterwards, Wall Street Journal columnist Jason Riley with his book The Black Boom, in which he argues that some policies during the Trump administration improved the economic lives of African Americans. He's interviewed by Trump administration former acting chair of the Council on Economic Advisors, Thomas Phillipson. Watch Book TV every Sunday on C-SPAN 2 and find a full schedule on your program guide or watch online anytime at booktv.org.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. A few more headlines. Northern Virginia Community College's Alexandria campus, where First Lady Jill Biden teaches, was closed today after an anonymous bomb threat. CNN reports the First Lady was warned about the threat before she left the White House to teach a class and was never in danger. It was just last month that the second gentleman, Douglas Emhoff, had to leave a Black History Month event at a Washington, D.C. high school due to a security threat. And the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says a subvariant of the Omicron coronavirus, known as BA.2, is now the dominant strain in the United States, representing about 55% of the new cases for the week ending March 26th. BA.2 is thought to be even more transmissible than the original BA.1 Omicron strain, which itself was more contagious than the earlier versions of the virus. Food and Drug Administration today approving a second coronavirus vaccine booster shot for people ages 50 and older, granting the emergency use authorization to the vaccines from Pfizer and BioNTech and also from Moderna. Pfizer had initially requested authorization for people ages 65 and older, and Moderna requested broader authorization for all adults. Up till now, FDA had okayed the fourth doses only for people 12 and older who had severely weakened immune systems. This group now will be able to get an additional booster, a fifth shot. Some reaction from the White House. Communications Director Kate Bedington.
Is there any comment or reaction to the FDA approving a fourth booster shot for people over 50?
So this is a good thing, and it is a straightforward thing. The CDC and the FDA are now allowing and will make available booster shots, a fourth shot for people over 50 and for the immunocompromised. We have plenty of supply to ensure that those populations can receive these shots. But what I would say is that if it at some point it becomes recommended that the full population requires a fourth shot, we're going to need additional funding. We're going to need the additional funding we've requested of Congress to be able to provide those shots for the broader population. But we do have the supply, and people will be able to go. People in those populations over 50 and up will be able to go and get those shots.
The White House Communications Director Kate Bedington in the White House briefing room. Senate leaders saying they are still negotiating how to pay for the $22.5 billion in emergency COVID-19 program funding the White House has requested. The CDC still needs to sign off on that second COVID-19 booster shot, the fourth dose, before they can be administered. Reports say it's possible the CDC director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, may authorize the second booster shot but not recommend it because evidence of the effectiveness may not be strong enough. By the way, the communications director at the White House, Kate Bedington, taking the reporters' questions because both White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki and the Principal Deputy Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre have tested positive for COVID-19. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Democrat from New York, calling on Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas to resign or face possible impeachment. She tweeted, "Clarence Thomas should resign. If not, his failure to disclose income from right-wing organizations, recuse himself from matters involving his wife, and his vote to block the January 6th commission from key information must be investigated and could serve as grounds for impeachment." Both CBS News and Washington Post reporting that Clarence Thomas's wife, Ginny Thomas, exchanged text messages over several weeks between the 2020 election and the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, with then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows discussing possibly efforts to reverse the election outcome and make Donald Trump the winner. More on all this from the House Democratic leadership. The caucus chair, Hakeem Jeffries, and caucus vice chair, Pete Aguilar, was also a member of the committee investigating the January 6th attack at a news conference.
There's been a wide range of views expressed about how to react to the recent revelation about Justice Clarence Thomas. Some people calling for recusal, investigation, resignation, censure, impeachment. I wonder if this came up at the caucus meeting at all and where leadership stands on that.
Well, the January 6th Select Committee is doing tremendous work as it relates to the preservation of our democracy, uncovering the truth of what happened on January 6th, and making sure that it can be presented to the American people in the fullest possible way. I'll yield to Vice Chair Aguilar for further clarity on that. But it is deeply troubling that the wife of a Supreme Court justice appears to have been intimately involved in peddling the big lie, perhaps fanning the flames of the insurrection, and being involved in issues that clearly fall before the jurisdiction of a member of the United States Supreme Court. So this is a serious issue that needs to be explored. It is my hope that it'll be explored by the Judiciary Committee in terms of its areas of jurisdiction related to ethical conduct by Supreme Court justices, because no one is above the law. We have three separate and co-equal branches of government, and we need to look at the dynamics that were revealed by the communications between Mrs. Thomas and former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows.
The chairman mentioned that the Judiciary Committee may have continued conversations about this, and we will allow that to move forward, clearly and support those efforts. Specific to January 6th, I think it's important, and I know people want to talk about this yesterday, but the Carter ruling in California really does, from my perspective and the committee's perspective, crystallize what's at stake. And we know that there is news, that this is a newsworthy individual, but the specific ruling was just striking. And I'll quote it. If Dr. Eastman and President Trump's plan had worked, it would have permanently ended the peaceful transfer of power, undermining American democracy and the Constitution. If the country does not commit to investigating and pursuing accountability for those responsible, the court fears January 6th will repeat itself. That's what's at stake. That's why we're following House Resolution 503, to follow the facts, to chase down every possible lead. Nobody is above the law, as the chairman said, and we're going to treat individuals the same, no matter who they are. We're going to continue to face the facts. That's why Peter Navarro and Dan Scavino were on the receiving end of a contempt citation last night. And that's why we're going to continue to press forward and seek the truth and find the facts. That's exactly what House Resolution 503, that's what the committee is lockstep behind. If there is more to announce, the chairman will announce it. But at this point, we're focused on just continuing down the road that we have gone.
Congressman Pete Aguilar, Democrat from California, who is on the January 6th Attack Investigative Select Committee. He's also the House Democratic Caucus Vice Chair, news conference along with the caucus chair, Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York. Washington Post and CBS News also reporting that internal White House records from the day of the attack on the U.S. Capitol that were turned over to the Select Committee have a gap in President Donald Trump's phone logs of 7 hours and 37 minutes, including the period when the building itself was being assaulted. Another Select Committee member, Jimmy Raskin, Democrat from Maryland, interviewed today on MSNBC.
I'm very curious about these sudden and very long gaps in the record of phone calls, guests, and so on. One possibility when a gap like this exists is that the president or whomever we're looking at is using a different phone. And that could be a different office phone number than we have. It could be a burner phone for we all know. There's also the possibility that somebody is deliberately suppressing the release of these materials, and we just don't know, and that's something we want to look to. I will say that it seems like we've had overwhelming participation and cooperation from the witnesses we want to talk to, but the closer you get to Donald Trump, there's a coterie around him and an entourage that is blocking our ability to get information, and very specifically about the events that took place over the course of the afternoon.
Congressman Jamie Raskin interviewed on MSNBC today. President Joe Biden signing into law today the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. It makes lynching a federal hate crime punishable by up to 30 years in prison. UPI writes the bill is named after Emmett Till, a 14-year-old Chicago boy who was kidnapped and killed by lynching in 1955 for whistling at a white woman while on vacation in Mississippi. Till's mother held an open casket funeral to show the brutality of the crime. The funeral generally agreed to have helped begin the American Civil Rights Movement and spanned for decades. Joining President Biden at the signing ceremony in the White House Rose Garden, Vice President Kamala Harris.
So today we are gathered to do unfinished business, to acknowledge the horror in this part of our history, to state unequivocally that lynching is and has always been a hate crime, and to make clear that the federal government may now prosecute these crimes as such. Lynching is not a relic of the past. Racial acts of terror still occur in our nation. And when they do, we must all have the courage to name them and hold the perpetrators to account.
Vice President Kamala Harris in the White House Rose Garden before President Biden signed that Emmett Till anti-lynching bill into law. The bill recently passed the Senate unanimously, and it passed overwhelmingly in the House, but there were 3 no votes. In the U.S. Capitol building, tributes today to the late Congressman Don Young, Republican from Alaska, lying in state in Statuary Hall, the old House chamber. Don Young was first elected in 1972. He died about a week and a half ago at the age of 88. His just over 49 years service in the U.S. House, making him the longest-serving member currently, the Dean of the House, and also the longest-serving Republican congressman in U.S. history. The House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy from California speaking about Congressman Young's accomplishments.
Think about the things Don saw. Think about all the things he did. He was a lead sponsor of more than 123 bills that became law, including the Transatlantic Pipeline and Anwar leases. 10 presidents signed his bills into law. 10. He served with 9 speakers and more than 2,000 members of Congress. See, Don took this job very seriously, very seriously. He would tell me that. And many of you don't know, Don was sober for 23 years. He told me he didn't drink on election years. At least that's what he said. His decades of service have filled every room and has touched every member. But most of all, it has touched every corner of Alaska. You see, I was whip. You never whipped Don. He told you where he stood. And it didn't matter on party or anything else. Alaska came first.
Congressman Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader, Republican leader from California, in the U.S. Capitol building during today's ceremony. Also speaking, the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, who spoke of Congressman Young's bipartisanship.
Don was a committed conservative. Indeed, he was the longest-serving Republican in the history of the House, as has been said. But he was always willing to reach across the aisle, and it meant delivering for Alaska. Indeed, he took great pride in the photographs of him with 10 presidents of both parties who signed his bipartisan bills into law which proudly covered the walls of his Rayburn office. It was always clear that he was passionate about this institution and his unique ability to make a difference for Alaska and for America.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Alaska has one U.S. House seat, so Congressman Young was the entire House delegation from that state. And today, the 2 U.S. senators from Alaska also taking part in the ceremony, remembering their friend and colleague. Here's Senator Lisa Murkowski, a Republican.
He was as colorful as they came. He was tough, but he was loyal. And loyalty nowadays seems to be a commodity that can be in short supply, but Don Young was loyal. He was gruff, but he had a soft spot. He could be so caring, so compassionate. And he was not just a colleague to me, but he was a mentor. He was my friend. He truly has been my congressman for all of my tenure. And again, the congressman for all of Alaska, for so many Alaskans' lives. It is also important to know that as much as he loved Alaska and Alaskans, he loved the institution. He loved the House of Representatives. And it showed. It showed in the respect that he had for his colleagues, and he would be barking at you, but then he would say, let's make this happen. Let's make this happen for the right reasons.
Senator Lisa Murkowski. Congressman Don Young is the 43rd person to lie in state and the 11th since 2018. President Joe Biden, a former U.S. Senator whose service overlapped with Congressman Young, also coming to Capitol Hill to pay his respects to the late Congressman. President Biden saying in a statement following Young's death, there's no doubt that few legislators have left a greater mark on their state. There are public memorial services for Congressman Young scheduled tomorrow at St. Francis Episcopal Church in Great Falls, Virginia, and then on Saturday at Anchorage Baptist Temple in Anchorage, Alaska. There's also a special election already scheduled for Alaska to fill the seat. And thanks for listening to Washington Today. You can get more top Washington stories delivered to you each day by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter Word for Word. Go to c-span.org/connect to sign up. Have a good night.